Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Hello, welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland, New Zealand, and joined today by our full panel. We've got Zach. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's rainy in Seattle again.
And welcome back to the show again, Ilka. How are you?
Good. It's sunny in Philadelphia.
Sunny
80
in
degrees.
Philadelphia. Nice. And finally, Mary, how are you doing?
Really well. It's been sunny. It's going to rain again tomorrow, but we've had a nice break, so now we can appreciate the rain.
Nice. Yeah, I think we might be in sort of those shoulder periods where a bunch of us get similar-ish weather around the world because it's a little bit rainy, a little bit sunny here. As we're recording this, it's Good Friday for me, so Easter time sort of marks about a quarter of the way through the year for a lot of people. So things are trucking along. Now we've got a great interview today to get into. Thank you, Ilka and Mary, for bringing us another I found very inspiring and just incredible leadership shown by an incredible group of women, which was really awesome to listen to. So great to get into that. But before we do, Zach, you want to do a bit of a shout out to some supporters?
Absolutely. So everything we do at the Accelerator, including the Passive House podcast, comes thanks to generous support from our sponsors. So a big thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxter Ingwe Architects, Glavel, Minutair, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Now, Mary, I think you published an article on Lorrie Rand a little while ago about some retrofit projects in Halifax.
Yes, there's actually been two articles that we've done on the her retrofit and also on Recover, the program that the initiative she started that she'll talk about more in the interview.
Yeah. Some listeners of the show will be familiar with Lorrie's work and Habit Studio, and also some of the other initiatives, and we'll put some links to those in the show notes. So should we just get straight into it?
So welcome, Lorrie Rand, to the Passive House Accelerator podcast. And you are principal at Habit Studio and co-founder, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
The last time we talked, Habit Studio was working on a retrofit of a commercial building that was to be your new office. And so I'm wondering, how's that going?
Yeah. So it's still going. It hasn't finished yet. So we're doing a Passive House retrofit to an 1850s house that's located here in Halifax, and it will be our future office. And we've had, just because we're in the industry doesn't mean we're immune to the typical delays and snags that happen on every project. much as we had hoped wouldn't be the case. So early on, we were affected by some supply chain issues. Given that it's a retrofit to a very old building, we had some very particular sizes of structural things we needed, which meant that we were waiting a long time. And then I don't know if you probably remember Hurricane Fiona. So that hit Halifax quite hard. Well, it hit Nova Scotia quite hard, didn't hit Halifax too badly. But what it meant was that our building was fine, but our crew got deployed to some emergency work on other sites. And we had to just be really patient for a little while. So now we have guys there every day actively building, but we're definitely not on track for our original timeline.
And backing up for our audience a bit, how many people are on your team now? And from your website, it looks like they're all women. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So currently, and really Habit Studio has always been an all women team. We are actually, that's a lie. We had for about a year, we had a trans person who worked with us. So we are a team of 8, 5 full-time, 3 part-time women. And we are, moving into this new space. We actually kind of need new space if we are to expand our team beyond what we have now, although there's no imminent plans to start hiring new people yet.
So yeah, I actually just freshed up on the articles that are already available on the accelerator that you did with Mary, and they're both very they're great, and I encourage everyone to go back and read them as well. And yeah, it talks about here the Habit Studio, but also about Recover. So can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so Recover is an organization that we recently set up as a non-for-profit. We sort of had a little bit of confusion about what our structure was going to be, but we're officially now a non-for-profit. And it was almost an organization that we started by accident, starting with a pilot study that we did, looking at how do we scale retrofits here in our province of Nova Scotia. And so we got this little pot of funding, myself and 2 friends, Nick Rudnicki and Emma Norton. And that was right at the start of the pandemic. And so we finished our study in about June or July of 2020. And then we decided to host a webinar. And because everybody was stuck in their houses, we had over 100 people sign up to attend our webinar. And we were basically telling what we learned studying this small apartment building here in Halifax. And then from that, we somehow started working with Toronto Community Housing, and we did a study for them looking at how could we retrofit their townhouse portfolio to meet their climate goals, which in their case, they need to achieve 25% carbon reductions across their portfolio by 2028. They have a pretty big, aggressive target. So that was kind of summer of 2021. And
I just want to interject here. So the Toronto Community Housing Association that you've been working with has roughly 2,100 properties. Not all of those are townhouses, but...
Correct. I think that number has changed. So when we first started working with them, they had 2,100 buildings. I think it's reduced now because what they've done is a number, their portfolio is high rises, low-rise apartments, and townhouses, and they had a lot of duplex or single-family properties, which they actually have divested of since us doing that study. So I believe, and I'm not super in the know on this, but my understanding is that they some of those properties were kind of handed over or sold to neighborhood trusts or community trusts and other sort of smaller management situations. So they have less properties, but they're able to focus more on the, the more dense building types now. So I think that number is more like 1,800, but don't quote me. I'm not totally sure.
Right. I just wanted to give the audience a sense of that it's a large housing association.
Something like 60,000 people live in Toronto Community, or, are housed by Toronto Community Housing. And, it's the second largest affordable housing agency in North America. So it's, to go from us doing, let's study a 4-unit apartment in Halifax to working with Toronto Community Housing was kind of a little bit shocking. We were kind of like, okay, this is what we're doing now. And then, like that study, it's interesting, like what we found was that, there were a few pathways to taking the building that we studied with them from, from kind of, I don't want to make Toronto Community Housing sound terrible, but, just really shocking conditions in terms of the amount of energy use and also the comfort issues that were experienced in the particular townhouse that we studied, to basically 100% greenhouse gas reductions by electrifying the building and energy savings in the sort of 95% range or something like that. But what it turned into was an economic study, in that because in both of our studies that we did, we worked with a company called CFAR Analytics based in Winnipeg to do total cost of building ownership analysis. And in that analysis, it really kind of just proved that the kind of, if you look at the total lifespan of the building, which we assume is 50 to 60 years, because we're kind of trying to prolong the life of buildings to save on the embodied carbon, that taking a building essentially to passive house performance is always going to result in the lowest cost of total building ownership over time. And from that, our retrofit that we've proposed is kind of like, but it's not put on a shelf, but like, there's like, okay, how are we going to roll this out across the portfolio? And so TCH is now working with, first on that whole economic plan. Like, what would be the total cost of portfolio ownership if we roll out this retrofit recipe across all of their townhouses, which is a pretty cool study too. So basically, for them, because they have this commitment to meet a 25% carbon reduction across their portfolio in a really short amount of time, they have to figure out how to make the changes and like snowball the effects really quickly. And so they're looking at the economics of that. And I'm optimistic that we're going to get to do more with them around that.
Were they already familiar with Passive House per se?
Or definitely. Yeah. They're definitely familiar with it. And, I think, because we were looking at townhouses, which are small buildings, a lot of their efforts so far to reduce carbon in their portfolio and reduce energy have been in the bigger buildings, which largely focus on mechanical retrofits. But in the last couple of months, actually, they have put out an RFP through Toronto Community Housing to do a panelized retrofit to a larger building, So basically, they're definitely aware of the benefits of envelope upgrades and are working through that as well. In our project, we were supported by TAF, the Atmospheric Fund. So they, Toronto Community Housing and the Atmospheric Fund work closely together. And so it's sort of, we were really kind of benefiting from a little bit of initial work that TAF had already started. We're trying to develop a procurement path for panelized retrofit. I don't think I said that Recover is focusing on panelized retrofits. Like, that was the focus of both our TCH project and our initial project here in Halifax. Sort of assuming that the energy strong approach is going to be, is something that we can adapt to the Canadian building culture as a way of scaling, at least probably not every building type, but a certain segment of buildings, that will be the answer to how we make some momentum happen in the retrofit space.
You were looking at 3 different panels, or were investigating 3 different panels?
Initially we did, and really, I mean, we kind of just modeled that. I mean, the performance is going to be, in terms of energy use, the same, no matter which kind of insulation you use. But we are very invested in low embodied carbon solutions, and so when we, I think a lot of times when somebody thinks about doing a retrofit, they just kind of imagine wrapping a building in foam and putting new cladding on it. And so we wanted to, in all of our projects, we want to explore, is this a scenario where we can essentially build a box full of cellulose and wrap a building in that? And there are absolutely going to be times when we can't do that because of code. If the building requires a completely non-combustible envelope, then we won't be able to do it. But it's what's interesting is that so far we've found more, we can use it more than we thought we could. So in that initial study and with Toronto Community Housing, we were kind of like, okay, we did the carbon calculations to see how much embodied carbon, retrofitting the conventional way would use, and how much we could sock away by just storing in the form of cellulose some carbon. And it's funny, you would think that I would have looked this up before being interviewed, but I did not.
That's okay. People can look it up on the
website. I'm just curious about the panel itself. How do you do that with cellulose? Because I know that a lot of people have the same goals, but they do struggle with getting that done.
So basically, it's built like a Larson truss. So a Larson truss is, I'll describe it in case you don't know, it's essentially kind of like a homemade TJI joist. So 2 parallel studs of 2x4, 2x6, doesn't really matter, and then they're strapped to each other with pieces of plywood or OSB, and so we would have series of parallel Larson trusses, and this was for our first 2 studies. And then we would have just plywood on one side and plywood sheathing, and on the other side we would have a membrane, and so all of that holds the cellulose in place. So it's really Nick is Nick's the builder, so that's his side of things. He's like, it's really just really fat siding. He's kind of like,
and that works. You looked at it for wood framed houses, but also for masonry houses.
Yeah, so that it can work on either. So there's been one masonry building retrofit done this way in Canada. So Ottawa Community Housing did a pilot project looking at exactly this. So they overclad a brick, I think it was a 4-unit townhouse in Ottawa a couple of years ago, maybe just over a year ago, and have been monitoring that building. And the brick certainly was problematic. Like it actually absorbed a lot of water in their case and caused them some headaches, but it seems like it's also managed to dry out and is looking pretty promising after a bit of monitoring results have come in.
Well, I know Nick was investigating the possibility of producing these types of panels, and I was wondering if that was happening or if there are other retrofit panel manufacturers that you have your eye on in Canada.
Yeah, so Nick he actually built a few things out of panels, and then over the last So I can't remember when we started. So since the summer, we've been actually working on another study that is NRCan funded. So Natural Resources Canada is funding us a 6-building study where we're working on 3 buildings in Nova Scotia and 2 in Ontario, and 1 is in Saskatoon, and looking at the viability of panelized retrofits on all of these buildings. They're all municipally owned buildings, and essentially what happened was we during that initial webinar that we had, a lot of municipal staff started listening to us and reaching out to us for advice, and kind of spun that into pitching this municipal project to NRCan, and they accepted it. So basically, every city and town across North America is working on a climate action plan or a community energy plan, figuring out how they're going to solve their own energy issues or climate goals. And so these are, every municipality has a portfolio of buildings that needs retrofits. So these are buildings that are you can find in every city or town across the country, I think, which is has been pretty interesting, kind of looking in 3 provinces, 3 climate zones, but at buildings that could be anywhere. So as we ramped that up, Nick got completely overwhelmed and decided he wasn't going to build things for a while. So he's actually hung up his hammer and is focusing on just these studies with our team. But that part of the reason he was able to do that is because we did identify some panelization companies who are interested in exploring the retrofit side of the market. So we have a couple here in Nova Scotia that that are currently producing panels, and they haven't done a panelized retrofit, but they're willing to kind of adapt to that scenario. And we found just about half a dozen in Ontario as well, who are kind of building, for the most part, they're building high performance new builds. So certainly all of the Ontario ones are making, passive house walls, but they're interested, especially I think those Ontario guys are really interested because Toronto Community Housing has very clearly demonstrated an interest, and they have a huge number of buildings. And so there would be, as they are, they've just, put out their first RFP for a panelized retrofit, but it could be 2,000 more or something if that one goes well. So I think it's pretty interesting actually that that's kind of the people who are already in the passive house space are we're interested in solving this retrofit side of things as well. I think the one downside of that is that we're all spread pretty thin. So industry wide, even though maybe there's been a little bit of a slowdown in some places because of the interest rates, really building is still going gangbusters. And North America wide, we have a trade shortage. We have we have a lot more demand than we have industry professionals able to keep up with. So I don't know what that means for retrofits, because we really don't, you could work on as many new builds as you wanted to for the rest of your life, but we need people to be working on fixing the buildings that we have.
Where do you the biggest challenges in developing or adapting to retrofit panels compared to new construction?
There's a lot of challenges. I mean, there's, the cost, the cost is a huge, obvious one. I think, there's lots of interesting things happening with the technical side of it. But there's going to be building types that are harder than others just because of structure. So what we're doing, we're adding a weight to the buildings, especially if we're trying to do it with boxes of cellulose instead of a pile of foam. And on the structural side, the thing that's become very evident on the structural side with the current 6 municipal buildings is that So on two of the buildings, we actually found that we couldn't add insulation easily because the existing poor performance was keeping the building upright in terms of the snow load. So the building was getting snowed on, it would melt and go away. And so if we actually added insulation in the roof, it was going to potentially be damage the building by holding on to the snow, which is a drag. And then some buildings, a lot of buildings have been really well engineered to kind of only support exactly what they're already supporting. And so to add extra weight is going to be challenging. So the masonry buildings actually are more promising on that route because there's usually reserve capacity structurally in masonry walls to hold a lot more weight. Metal buildings are going to be really hard. Did I even answer your question? I'm like,
yes, perfect. Yeah, no, everyone always talks about these challenges. And I was just curious if you approach these manufacturers that are already building panels for new construction, in what way they need to adapt what they're already doing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think because we've got, I think, these are not huge companies, and that makes them a little bit more nimble. So, maybe the long-term vision is that there's large facilities that are super automated and everything is engineered down to the smallest piece. But right now, what we have seen in the companies that we've talked to is that they have a big space, but they have kind of giant tables that pieces are getting put together on, and that they could adapt a bit, like the workflow or the kind of wall recipe or the roof recipe. And so I actually think that, in most of these cases, they're making small adjustments in every house based on, because they're passive house modeled, the wall might need to be slightly thicker or thinner, just slightly different for a specific design. And so they have these kind of, I'm encouraged by it that they have these kind of in their process, kind of minor adaptations. The overall approach is still the same. Ultimately, yeah, we're likely to have if this is going to get scaled in the way it needs to get scaled, I think that it's going to need to be more industrial, and maybe there'll be dedicated retrofit companies in addition to the kind of smaller guys that we've been talking to so far. But we'll see. I mean, it's essentially an entire industry needs to start, because we don't have a retrofit industry.
But fortunately, in Canada, I feel like that whole concept, developing a retrofit industry, is getting more attention than it is in the United States. And there's, just as one indication, there is an annual conference called Retrofit Canada. And it's coming up in June in Montreal. And I believe you're going to be speaking at it. Is that correct?
I think right now the plan is for my colleague Emma Norton to be the one from Recover who's speaking, but will be represented there. So I think this will be the third Retrofit Canada conference, the third annual one, and I spoke last year, so we're maybe taking turns. But the focus for sure this year is on sort of policy and where does policy need to go to support an industry that needs to mobilize at the kind of scale that the efforts for World War II or somebody, Peter Emerongen recently, I'm sure you know who that is. He compared retrofit ramp up needed to the Industrial Revolution, and it's kind of that's big talk, but we really do need to retrofit almost every building in this country if we're going to meet our climate goals. And maybe there's going to be some kind of magic bullet that comes and some magical machine that socks carbon away for us and we won't have to worry. But like until that magical thing comes, we have to assume that we have to start retrofitting our buildings. It's right now we're retrofitting about 0.7% of the buildings a year to the level that needs to be done, and we need to get to 12% in the next few years. So that's like that's just a kind of incredible amount of scaling work needs to happen, and it has to happen in policy. Like I firmly believe we actually have a lot of the technical answers. We just need the support and the framework that it's going to happen within.
It's not just for carbon sucking up, as you mentioned before, the thermal comfort and the energy efficiency, which is related to carbon, but certainly the thermal comfort and keeping the buildings providing housing, decent housing for people, keeping the stock.
We have joint crises of housing and climate issues, and in the Atlantic provinces where I live, we have the highest incidence of energy poverty among people who live here. We're at, it depends on whether your definition of energy poverty includes the gas for your cars that you need for transportation, or whether it's just heating your homes. But, if we are including gas for our cars, it's like 38% of people pay a disproportionate percentage of their income towards those kinds of expenses compared to the rest of our country. And that's because the rest of Canada has a lot of natural gas. The Atlantic provinces don't have a lot of natural gas, and gas is cheap. So we have lots of electricity, but also lots of fuel oil and other very dirty ways of keeping our buildings going.
Mm-hmm. And Toronto, just stepping back for a second to Toronto community housing and the very ambitious target they have to reduce their carbon emissions by, I think you said 2028, was it?
Yeah, so they received some funding from the federal government, a few years ago, and 2028 was like their deadline. So that's where that came from. So it's called the National Co-Investment Fund to reduce their energy use and carbon emissions by 25%. And I should say that I think that they're 7 or 8% of the way there. So they've put a little dent in it, but they still have, that's not that far away, 2028.
So you were saying that the big changes have to happen on policy level. And I totally agree with that. But on the other hand, I mean, look at what you did, right? With 3 people starting Recover, you've initiated a lot of change already. So I feel like we really have to emphasize that change has to happen on all different levels, correct?
You're absolutely right. And I think when I look back at the last 3 years, it's sort of amazing how far we've come and what we've been, that we get to work on retrofits, like in the way that we want to. I get really, really frustrated though, because it's like every building on my way home from work, even the buildings, Halifax, my city, has construction boom going on right now, and they're not building net zero buildings. Like the buildings that are getting built in the city also need a retrofit to meet our climate goals. So it's really, really frustrating. And policy changes coming for sure. Like, we have building code work, advances coming. We have there's lots of hopeful stuff. I mean, the federal government is investing in a lot of money in retrofits over the next few years. We're also seeing the impacts. Like we're in a hurricane region, but the hurricanes that hit us don't usually hit like that one did last fall. So it's very eye-opening. that we need to move as an industry faster. Yeah. So thank you for saying that. I feel like I'm like poo-pooing your compliments, but
no, but I do think sometimes we underestimate what everyone can do.
I think we can demonstrate, and I think that we definitely at Recover have shown that where there's willingness, you can go a long way. Yeah, and hopefully, I think if we can motivate people to consider working on retrofits instead of the new and shiny, I feel very satisfied.
Really, the convincing at every level people to work on retrofits, including the manufacturers.
And the people who own the buildings. A lot of people don't realize how big of a change you can bring about with a retrofit. And it doesn't always have to be, deeply invasive. That's hopefully what we're showing with Recover, that people can still be in the buildings and get a deep retrofit, saving 75% energy without moving anybody out. That's pretty profound.
It is profound. And what a positive change for them in so many ways, for the residents of those buildings. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lorrie, for taking time and coming to talk with us today. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited about the retrofit work you're doing. And thanks for all your efforts.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, so we are finalizing our reports for the 6 building study. So I'll let you know when they're public.
And that was Lorrie Rand of lots of places, really. I think Ilka and Mary, Habit Studio, but also Recover Initiative. Some fantastic work they're doing. I took a bunch of notes, but perhaps Ilka or Mary, do either of you want to go first and tell us what your highlights from that discussion were?
Well, I'm just really excited about the priority that Lorrie Rand has put on expanding retrofits and scaling them up, and also the funding that she's received from different governmental organizations in Canada to proceed with her work, which just shows at least some understanding that this is a necessary task that needs to get done in order to meet climate goals.
I thought that was a really good point that she mentioned, that she doesn't feel like it's a technical challenge, or at least the technology exists, but it's more what we need now is the policy and the sort of structural mechanisms to make that happen. How about you, Ilka?
Yeah, I was just very impressed again by the Recover initiative, how it was started by her and a few other people, and that they were just able to reach so many people, to raise awareness of what the issue is, and also propose some solutions to the retrofit issue.
I'm interested in probably all of your perspectives. There, would you say that Canada's slightly ahead on the retrofit scheme than the rest of North America?
I wouldn't necessarily say slightly ahead, but maybe there's more of a feeling of a national focus. As I was mentioning, there's that Retrofit Canada conference where people who are interested in figuring out how to scale up retrofits can meet and really dive into the topic. And the 3rd annual one is going to be happening, and we don't really have exactly the same. There are lots of conferences here in the U.S. on focus on retrofits and building performance, but not quite in the same feel.
It was inspiring that she's, making these happen. She also shared a daunting statistic with the 12% of buildings per year that need to be retrofitted to be on target for climate goals, which is a bigger number than I've heard before bantied about here in the US.
Jumping up from 0.7 at the moment, which is what they're doing. Yeah.
0.7 to 12, right? And I think that I've heard the number 1% here in the US exists as current, and 3% is it's required. So 12 is a big deal. I went back to look at Mary's article about her work and about Habit Studio, and saw the quote from Lorrie: "People have to stop studying retrofits and actually do them." So awesome. she's showing that it can be done. So let's get on with it.
Yeah. I like the way she framed it. It needs to be of the scale of the Industrial Revolution, and we need to approach this at that sort of scale across the board. I find it fascinating. I mean, we're having these conversations here in New Zealand. I know it's going on in Australia. We've come back from Germany nearly a month ago, where there's a lot of conversation about retrofits in Europe. So this is a great opportunity, I think, for us here at the Accelerator to bring all those ideas together and realize this is a global issue of that Industrial Revolution scale, that people are thinking about this, which is good. We need to be thinking about this all around the world, and there are going to be slightly different solutions, but I think a lot of those have been thought of, and we just kind of need to get on with it. Something jumped out at me, it was almost an offhand comment, but Lorrie said that taking a building essentially to passive house performance is always going to result in the lowest total cost in building ownership. And I really love that quote, because when we're talking to people about passive house for the very first time, the issue of cost always comes up. And I really like that concept of total home ownership, and that having done that analysis, to have that there as a statement is so powerful, to say, yeah, you're going to invest a little bit more upfront, but your total ownership cost over the life of that building is going to be much lower. So in that sense, building or retrofitting to passive house is the best cost-effective option.
What's really interesting about that comment, though, and I actually went back to the article as well, is how she says, because you're retrofitting to a longer lifespan, you actually have to adjust the payback period as well.
Right. Yeah. So that's part of the equation, is that you're saving a building for longer and saving all those resources.
Yeah. So it doesn't make sense to just translate the payback period over like the typical 15 to 20 years, because in fact, you should be doing over 50 to 60 years.
Yeah, which is more realistic. I mean, how many buildings get knocked down after 15 years?
Yeah.
Only the really crappy ones.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be a lot of interest, at least on my part, but I think other people to follow along with, and see. I appreciate that there's a study being done of the masonry building in Ottawa, and that they're, looking at the moisture content, because there are, some people still question whether adding exterior insulation to a masonry building is really going to work or not. So
right.
I think that's something to keep our eyes on.
Sounds like someone's going to be busy doing some woofy analysis. Yeah, I guess the at the close there, just that reminder of the impact that a few passionate, dedicated people can make. And it seems like a daunting task to ramp up that 0.7% currently to 12%, and really having an industrial revolution scale retrofit program. But so much has been achieved just by a few dedicated people getting things going. Which is, very, very promising.
Right. And I just have to also jump in here that that Toronto Community Housing is putting out an RFP that manufacturers can respond to about doing a panelized retrofit. And, that incentive when such a large community housing agency puts out an RFP like that, because they know there's so many more buildings that are owned by that one agency, that, can be in the pipeline if they get the RFP. So it's a great stimulus program.
Absolutely. Yeah. Nice work. Thank you, as always, Ilka, Mary. Never fail to bring us some very inspiring, amazing people. So, Zach, what do we got coming up?
So at PassiveHouse Accelerator Live this week, we have Vicky Yee from Stephen Winter Associates joining us for a next gen episode of the show. And she will be presenting the future of package terminal heat pumps, or PTHPs, and PassiveHouse. So that's noon Eastern on Wednesday, April 12th, which would mean it's early in the morning, Thursday, April 13th for you, Matthew. And then the next week on PassiveHouse Accelerator Live, we'll have a project showcase edition of the show. We'll be joined by Jamie Hart of Public and Stuart Hood and Thomas Bamber of Introba, and they'll be presenting about the Vienna House in Vancouver, designing for connectedness and climate resilience. And then also we want to make sure that folks know about the PassiveHouse Canada conference that's coming up in Hamilton, Ontario, May 8th through 10th, 2023. So right around the corner, and we'll include a link to that and all the other events that are going on in the show notes.
Very good. Thank you very much for that, Zach. Thank you again, Ilka, Mary, and of course to all our supporters and our listeners. And we'll be back again next week with a regular episode on Passive House Podcast.